It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the ineluctable John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How you doing this morning, John?
Well, I won't complain too much of it. I've been better. I had the second shot of the Moderna vaccine yesterday, and woke up this morning feeling like a truck ran over me. But then I was thinking about our show, was it last week or 2 weeks ago now, about Michael Jordan. What was it? Game 5 of the 98 finals against the Utah Jazz, waking up with food poisoning, flu-like symptoms, barely able to walk. And what did he do? He, put up 40 points or something in that game.
Yeah, I think it was the 97 finals against Utah. Well, it was a long time ago, so I might be misremembering. But yeah, he looked like warmed over death. He was just sweating, just standing there. They had to practically carry him off the court. He scored like 38. This is NBA legend. This is legendary stuff. In the NBA finals. So, yeah, the show must go on, and we know what a trooper you are, John.
If Michael could do that, I'm inspired to persevere. As our other hero Shackleton said, obstacles are just things to be overcome.
Absolutely right. It's great. What episode is this now? This is episode like 40 something, isn't it?
49, I think.
49. So we're pushing 50. We have this whole reservoir of heroes that we've discussed, and we keep referring to them. Ernest Shackleton. Obstacles are just things to overcome. Andrew Carnegie. Right, a sunny disposition is worth a fortune. It's great. We can make these references, to all the material that we've already backlogged. It's rich, and we could use it to inspire our own lives.
Absolutely, that's one of the main things I get out of this, and I hope you listeners do too. Is there's so much wisdom to take from these people that have just lived fantastic lives, done incredible things, and the whole point really is to not just to laud their achievements and applaud them like we do, but also to use their examples in our own lives. So
right, to inspire us to be more heroic and to take Shackleton's attitude that obstacles are just things to be overcome. And I've been really looking forward to today's show, John, because everybody out there in Hero Land, because this is a point of departure for us. Mm-hmm. We haven't discussed romance before on the Hero Show, and the title for today is the heroic romance of Barrett Browning and Elizabeth Barrett, and it certainly was. It's we got phone going off, but that obstacles are just things to be overcome. But with those two, I mean, what's so inspiring to me is just, first of all, just the way these two loved each other. I mean, the love that they had for each other is just a beautiful thing. And we'll read some of their poetry. But then the obstacles they overcame with her ill health and her sick bastard of a father, to have the kind of relationship they did, it belongs on the Hero Show, I think.
Yeah. It's itself poetic. You have the love story of two poets that come together, and they come together over their work, their mutual affection for one another's poetry, and just one of the probably the most famous love story of the 19th century, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Of all the real life love stories that I know of, to me, this is the most beautiful and the most inspiring. Mm-hmm. It's like Cyrano, but with a happy ending. Mm-hmm. And I want to point out one caveat here. God knows what kind of love stories have taken place in real life that we don't know about. Like under a communist regime where one of the lovers was from a bourgeois family, and and the other lover was from a proletarian family. What things like that, and the obstacles that under the Nazis, where one of the lovers was a Christian and the other was a Jew. The obstacles that people like that overcame to have a romantic relationship. We might never have heard of it, but Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett is a famous real life love story, and it really is touching. I'm going to read some of Elizabeth Barrett's poems to her husband. I can't read them without crying.
Yeah.
But just people are just going to have to put up with that. That's. And this is the first show we've done about about two people, right? About
a couple, yes, but we did do Vivian Thomas, and remind me.
Yeah, what was her name? We
talked about her last week.
Cecilia Payne.
Yes.
But those were like two separate stories, on one show. This is a pair of people who are a couple. But anyhow, regardless, we should give the dates here, because Elizabeth Barrett was older than her husband, and from what I've read, she never did tell him when she was born. She told him the month and the day, but not the year. Which is that, how feminine is that? She didn't want her husband to know her exact age. But Elizabeth Barrett's dates are 1806 to 1861, and Robert Browning 1812 to 1889. So she was 6 years older than he was, and he outlived her by 28 years and never remarried.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how many parallels there are between their life stories. Both lived at home with their parents for a long time while young. Both took an early affection to romantic literature and especially poetry. Both made use of large libraries from their parents, and that fueled their growth. Both had very little formal education. Robert Browning convinced his parents when he was pretty young to let him homeschool with a tutor and just use his father's very big library, and something like 6,000 volumes. And then he went to college for only a year and dropped out after that. So on a par in so many ways. I hear even that both were of Jamaican descent. They had ancestors that were from Jamaica, and this perhaps has something to do with, as we'll talk about, Elizabeth's father's very peculiar view on marriage.
Yeah, Mr. Barrett had been a slave owner. Certainly came from a family that had been slave owners. I think he was himself.
He was,
before abolition, and Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning were both devout abolitionists. Was another thing that they bonded over. But yeah, he forbade. Mr. Barrett had like 12 children,
mm-hmm.
and his wife had died younger, Elizabeth's mother, and he was a strict authoritarian. He forbade their kids to marry, his kids to marry. In the great play, we should mention Rudolph Bessier's play. Rudolph Bessier, American playwright, wrote The Barretts of Wimpole Street, an outstanding, fictional version of this romance. Was made into a famous movie, I think in the 1930s, before my time. But I used to watch all those old golden age Hollywood movies on the Late Show when I was a kid. Frederick March played Robert Browning, as I recall, right? In the film, one of the great, Hollywood actors from the golden age. I mean, Frederick March, when I think of Frederick March, I think Jean Valjean, in Les Miserables. I think Matthew Harrison Brady in Inherit the Wind. He's one, by the way, just as an aside, everybody, Frederick March is one of the few actors to have won multiple Oscars and Tonys. He had 2 Oscars as best actor, best years of our lives, one of his famous films. I can't remember if that was one of his Oscars, but he had 2 Oscars and 2 Tonys, on Broadway. So he was a consummate he was a consummate actor. Great choice to play Robert Browning. I think Norma Shearer played Elizabeth Barrett in that old 1930s movie. I remember it being good, but I mean, I was 16 years old when I saw it on TV, in 1960. So, but the point, of course, is in the play that is based on the Barretts of Wimpole Street. Um, Rudolph Bessier hints at Barrett's reasons, right? He said that he became this very strict religious guy, and he thought sex was dirty. And he says at one point in the play, after what did he say? After years of intense effort, I strangled that desire in myself. He says, I strangled the sexual desire. I remember reading that. No, that's not something you want to strangle, bro. And he was trying to protect his children, at least in the fictional version. I'm not sure if this is the accurate real life, but I know Bessier's play is generally very accurate. He wanted to protect his children from the dirty, sexual appetite that they would be indulging in if they were married.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are several theories about why he didn't want any of his children to marry, and he threatened each of them. Made the same threat: if you get married, I'll disinherit you. And he did, as we know, end up disinheriting Elizabeth. But a couple of different
his favorite
theories.
child, his firstborn and favorite child, he still disinherited her when she married, and she wrote him letters, and he wouldn't even open them to read them.
Some say that he had this sort of patriarch mentality, that he wanted to have all of his kids under his control, under his own roof. Another theory that I don't know how plausible it is, but some say that when he discovered that perhaps there was some African blood in his family line, he decided that he wanted to essentially stop the family line, even though he had already had 12 kids, which I think makes little sense. And if it were the case, would obviously be the most shameful of these various reasons, all very bad reasons, but this one is terrible.
Yeah, that's just pure racism.
Yeah.
But the anti-sex mentality of the devout Christianity, that's not so hot either. That's right. Also irrational and despicable. But yeah, I mean, he's and you'd want to tell Mr. Barrett, if you take this stance against romantic love, then you are going against nature. The most natural desire in human life, is to seek love, and the most powerful and joyous emotion in human life. That intimacy of a beautiful romantic relationship. You're fighting against nature, bro, and you're going to lose. And he does. His beloved firstborn daughter, who, as authoritarian as he was, in her youth, he encouraged her writing. He encouraged it. He was, that's why you could see Elizabeth had a strong devotion to him. He was one who had strongly encouraged her to write. And he supported that, emotionally and financially. He supported that. You can see why she was devoted to him. But you take that stance against romantic love, you're going to lose. And he does.
Yeah, I think we should say just a little bit more about their childhoods. Elizabeth was, like you said, very encouraged by her father to read and to write. She immersed herself in books whenever she could. Her family was pretty active socially, and so whenever she could get away, she did. But she was quite precocious. She was writing her own verse supposedly at 4, reading novels by age 6, and entranced by Alexander Pope's translation of the Iliad at age 8, studying Greek by 10, and wrote her own Homeric epic poem at age 11, The Battle of Marathon. Her father, like we said, encouraged her. He even nicknamed her the poet laureate of Hope End, which was this Turkish mansion that he had built, where she spent much of her childhood. And then in 1820, when she's 14 or 15 years old, she develops these medical problems that were never really resolved in her lifetime. 2 of her sisters also suffered too. They recovered, but she developed chest pains in her head, pains in her spinal cord. And we really don't know what the cause was. There are a lot of theories based on letters, based on her own reports of what she was feeling, but we don't really know. In any case, she began taking laudanum for the pain, and opiates can have all sorts of effects. Some say that the drugs really intensified her poetry because she had these more intense emotions, but we don't know. We know that in all likelihood it did make her more frail, and she never really recovered. She just continued to sort of get worse throughout her life, and so by the time she and Robert Browning later meet and fall in love, she's lived most of her life under her father's roof and hasn't really experienced much. I believe she's around, what was it, 36 or 38 years old when they meet, and so is considered something of a spinster. And we can say much the same about Robert. He very precocious as well. He wrote a book of poetry at the age of 12, but found no publisher for it.
And then he burned the poems, right?
He did, yeah.
Please, you want to publish? I'm going to burn it.
And also, this is another interesting parallel. He discovered Percy Bysshe Shelley and became a huge fan. And Elizabeth Barrett discovered Mary Wollstonecraft, whose daughter later married Shelley. But they're both here at a very young age, falling in love with the works of two families that were to unite, and clearly had a lot in common in terms of their values. They had a lot of shared values. Shelley
reminded me,
yeah.
So last week, John, we discussed Richard Feynman, the great scientist, and for me, all those advances in physics, I could name them, but it all went over my head. I had no idea what it all meant. But now we're in the field of literature, so I'm in my element. I was an English major in college, and I remember reading Shelley. I always liked Shelley. "O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind?" That great closing line from "Ode to the West Wind," and they were both fans of Shelley and Mary Shelley, Mary Godwin, right, the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, who married Shelley, Mary Godwin Shelley, and wrote Frankenstein, of course, which is a fascinating Gothic novel, but it's got a real, it's early 19th century. It's got a real strong anti-industrial, theme to it. Is very strongly against against technology and industrialization. But unfortunately, you see a lot of humanities people from that day to this 200 years later against technology and scientific advance and industry, and its most overt manifestation nowadays, the environmentalist movement. But as they say, John, that's another story for another day. And the Brownings certainly were fascinated by the Shelleys. So you're right. They had a lot. Robert and Elizabeth had a lot of similarities. But I'm sorry, I'm an inveterate talker. I interrupted you when you were talking about Browning's youth.
Oh, you brought something there. There's another parallel that I think is worth mentioning. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she big fan of Shelley, and she bought into this idea that you were talking about a minute ago, I think, to some extent, of this sort of anti-industrial mentality. So child labor at the time was considered by some to be a pretty horrific practice. And I think there were definitely things that were happening that were terrible for kids. And some were being mutilated in this or that way, getting hurt at work and working incredibly long hours. And so Elizabeth was sort of an activist against this. especially later in life. And both were pretty active politically. They had a lot of strong political views and expressed those sometimes in poetry, which is pretty interesting, and often would write on things like this. And so I think, there is that parallel even down to the Brownings, and especially with Elizabeth and this whole child labor movement, anti-child labor movement. It's understandable.
Let me just say something here, John.
Yeah.
Because the author of the Capitalist Manifesto would be remiss if he didn't say something like on this. But the truth is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, people were desperately poor. I mean, they very often couldn't even feed their children, and then so children worked backbreaking hours in the fields in agricultural work. Parents vastly preferred their children working in the factories to backbreaking work in the fields. One, because they made more money in the factories. The factories more productive, generated more wealth, were able to pay higher wages. But two, the work was much lighter. Work in the machinery was much lighter than moving boulders, in the field and, all this stuff. So it was the child labors existed long before the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, one, made it lighter, and two, eventually, with the wealth created by industrialization, made it possible for mom and dad to make enough money to support their children without the children having to work. That's what ended child labor. And if it weren't, the legislation that ended it would have been utterly cruel, because when the parents were too poor to feed their children, if you ended it by governmental fiat, then what that means is the children wouldn't have enough to eat and they would starve to death. So I understand, the desire to protect the children, but this anti-industrial hostility, infected that view. And by the way, it was the wealth creation of capitalist system. I think we know today, from the field of economic history, studying 19th century English history, it was the wealth created by the capitalist system that ended child labor, not governmental legislation. Child labor was on its way out when the politicians got involved. So, but anyhow, I just had to interrupt to get that, to make that point.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, there's the same thing I was going to say is this. It's a pretty irrational view that doesn't take into account the long-term effects of that sort of policy. And we see that sort of thinking again and again in economic issues.
Yeah. And by the way, as an aside, I think the laws against children working should be abolished. I think children should work, not working in the fields, hefting boulders around, but I think children should be, working from a very early age. Nothing, work that's commensurate with their abilities. Sweeping the floor at McDonald's when you have to be, what's the age, 14 to get a job, and 16, I think, for most jobs.
Mm-hmm. That sounds right. I think it might vary a little bit based on the state, but when I was in New Hampshire, I couldn't get a job until I was 16. So
yeah, live free or die, but they won't let you work at age 15. But there's no reason why if a kid wants to work, and especially if mom and dad are poor. Actually, I would say especially if mom and dad are rich. If mom and dad are rich, I think the kids should even more should be working, because it's too easy for wealthy parents to make sure that their kids have everything without any effort. But if the kid's 12 years old from a rich family, that's really cool. I think if you're 12 years old from a rich family and you get a job sweeping the floors at McDonald's, or sweeping and mopping the floors, which you could easily do at age 12. It's not physically backbreaking work. And, you got to be at work on time. You have a certain job, you got to perform. And there's nothing better than working to develop the sense of personal responsibility, which is a hugely important point for anybody to learn to take responsibility for their own lives.
Yeah, we talked about Andrew Carnegie a few shows back, and what was he, like 10 years old or something when he got his first job, and when he brought home his first paycheck, he said it was one of the happiest days of his life, and no money that he ever made after that compared to that feeling of becoming a breadwinner in his family. He'd so long been supported by his parents, and now he could help out, and of course went on to help out quite a bit.
Yeah, yeah, he sure did. And became the most productive steel manufacturer in the world, as we discussed, and his productivity made possible so much. Henry Ford's, ability to manufacture automobiles inexpensively, skyscrapers, agricultural technology. Carnegie was an enormously productive individual. And yeah, you're right. 12 years old, first job, working in a factory, $1.20 a week, which today, I don't know, was worth like $20 or $30, per week. And that was the money he was most proud of, which I could understand. So anyhow, so Elizabeth Barrett was opposed to child labor. A lot of literary figures and humanities types were, back then, and probably still are.
Yeah, and both had one respect in which they really differed before their romance blossomed was their poetic or literary careers. Robert was his success was a lot more spotty. His first published work under his name, Pauline, a Fragment of a Confession. Some people liked it. Dante Gabriel Rossetti liked it. John Stuart Mill said that the author suffered from an intense self-consciousness. He thought it was terrible. So that was 1833. And then a couple of years later, he published an interesting poem about the 16th century alchemist Paracelsus rather. And that was more widely positively reviewed. But then a few years later, in 1838, he writes several plays that are duds. And one, Sordello, earned him this reputation for just being a careless and obscure writer. The funniest thing, Alfred Tennyson, of course, great poet of the age, he reported that his wife read it, and by the end of it, she couldn't tell if Sordello was a man, a book, or a city.
John, I got to make a confession here. A lot of Barrett Browning is very difficult to read. I regard it as dense. And so preparing for this show the other day, I sent an email to our good friend Shoshana Milgram, who came on the show to help us discuss and did a great job discussing Victor Hugo. So I said, Shoshana, I find Browning dense. Do you have any recommendations? And she sent me back a recommendation for a couple of poems, one of which reminded me, The Last Duchess, which I'm going to read in a little while, is very powerful. Browning can be dense and obtuse without a doubt, but Browning at his best is a powerful writer who perfected, perhaps he invented, or perhaps he created, but he certainly perfected the form of the dramatic monologue, and he's just the master of it. And as much as I love Elizabeth Barrett, and her person, her story, her love poetry, there's no doubt that he's a much greater poet than she is, and he's got an exalted reputation in our day. And I think at his best, he deserves it. But yeah, you were saying his career was spotty, whereas her career was successful almost right from the start, wasn't it?
Yeah, some of her first work. So the poem that she wrote at 14 that we mentioned earlier, The Battle of Marathon, that was published privately. Her father arranged to publish that and only circulated it among the family. But her later works, the ones that were published under her name, did very well, whereas Browning's, for the most part, didn't. I mean, here and there. But it wasn't until much later in his career that he earned the reputation that he now has. So
right. The Ring in the Book, I think, cemented his reputation. But speaking of how spotty and inconsistent Browning was, listen to this. I have a great quote from Oscar Wilde, and Oscar Wilde was, a brilliant dramatist and just a scintillating wit. Oscar Wilde said, quote, about Browning, "He is the most Shakespearean creature since Shakespeare. If Shakespeare could sing with myriad lips, Browning could stammer through 1,000 mouths." Considered from the point of view of a creator of character, he ranks next to him who made Hamlet. Had he been articulate, he might have sat beside him. The only man who could touch the hem of his garment is George Meredith. Meredith is a prose Browning, and so is Browning. he used poetry as a medium for writing prose, unquote, from Oscar Wilde. So had he been articulate, imagine saying that about a poet who had written thousands and thousands of lines like Browning did. But yeah, as we pointed out, the inconsistency in Browning's writing. But we're gonna look at Browning at his best.
Yeah, and so his life is sort of this. He's sort of loafing off his parents and living at home until he's in his mid-30s. And I forget the name of you probably know it, the poem, but Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a poem that did very, very well, in which she actually referenced one of Browning's poems, and did so very positively. And not long after, and I'll let you tell this story, she'll tell it much better than I, Browning decided to write to her and to confess that he loved not only his poetry, but the poet herself.
Sight unseen. They had never met because, Elizabeth Barrett was a invalid and a recluse. And you're right, his poems, well, they regarding their reception, it was very mixed. Whereas she was an established poet and widely acclaimed, and she praised Browning's poems in writing, which meant a lot to him, coming from a poetess who was very successful and one he admired. And he wrote to her, having never met her, he's, I love your verses, Miss Barrett, and I love you. What? Now this is what, 1845 maybe.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So Elizabeth is 39 years old, having been born in 1806, an invalid. Everybody's telling her she's not going to live very long. She's forced to stay in this hot house room where the temperature is always very high. The windows are closed. They don't open the windows to let in fresh air. The doctors, her father thinks she's going to die. The doctors think she is frail. But so Browning, of course, they start a correspondence. He wangles an invitation to come visit her in 1845, and visiting her in her sick room. And Browning, it's interesting, John, because you're right. He lived at home with mom and dad until he was 34 or something like that. It's interesting because he's this fountain of vitality. He's got this tremendously robust energy, and you see it in his writing and his best. He comes in, and in the play, The Barretts of Wimpole Street, which is fiction, but it's true to the characters. He says to her something like, "I have enough energy for both of us," which was true, and the way Rudolph Besche depicts it in the play, which may well be true to real life. Elizabeth Barrett was bedridden and she couldn't walk, without somebody helping her. As he leaves, she gets up out of the bed, and walks to the window to see him, to see him walk away, which may or may not have happened in real life. I don't know, but it's very possible that she is invigorated by this blossoming romantic relationship for the first time in her life, and she realizes, well, why can't I have love? I deserve love as much as any other woman. Why can't I experience this? And the thing that I love about Elizabeth Barrett that comes through in her writing, so vividly, is she's got this beautiful soul. It's very alive. The vitality of her soul, unfortunately, was not matched by her bodily health. As a young woman, somebody who knew her described her as, pretty, slight figure, physically frail, and but her soul is very alive, and it's like Browning's love and his energy and his vitality is just it's like it infuses her with a physical vitality that matches the aliveness of her soul, and it's this beautiful thing. It's very touching. And
they kick off this courtship in 1845. They pass letters back and forth for a while, and finally meet, but continue to write. And at some point, Browning uh, he asks, can I ask your father for your hand? And she knows how that will go. She already knows
Right.
that her father won't let her marry, and she sort of backs off she backs off a bit in this relationship, but Browning perseveres. They continue to write to each other, and finally, in time, she uh, really starts to reciprocate his feelings for her, and they continue to court secretly to avoid her father's disapproval.
Yeah,
And
fortunately, he's at work a lot, so Browning could come to the house during the day and meet with Elizabeth without the father knowing.
mhm,
And he proposes to her, and what she realizes, this is in 1846, she realizes my father will never consent to this. There's nothing that I could do that will enable him to consent to this. And so she agrees to marry him in secret. They go to the church at Saint Marylebone. I love the English names, to the Marylebone, and they get married in secret, and she lives at home. Her doctors wanted her to go to Italy anyway for her
that's
health.
right.
And,
Yeah,
and
and her father doesn't even want that. I mean, the doctors are saying you can't last another winter here. You've got to go to a warmer climate and recuperate. And her father seems to be okay with the fact that she's not going to be able to live there. And they get married, and
and that might
unfortunately,
excuse me, interrupt for just a second, John. That may have been part of what convinced her to accept Browning's proposal.
it
That
could very well could have
that
been.
her father absolutely opposed, even though he obviously loved her in his tyrannical way. He opposed her going to Italy, which would have improved her health and probably extended her life expectancy, and he opposed it.
Hmm.
At that point, you could see why Elizabeth would say, no more of this. I'm going to marry. I love Robert. I'm going to marry him, and we're going to go to Italy.
They get married, and unfortunately, they don't go straight to Italy. They don't have their honeymoon just yet. She has to go back home and hide this fact that she's just been married from her father for another week, and then they take off along with Elizabeth's servant, and they move to Italy.
Yeah, her
And
maid Wilson was very loyal. It
mhm,
was very loyal to Elizabeth, and I think she was a witness at the wedding, wasn't she?
I believe so.
I think so. I wonder if Flush, her dog, was there.
Yes, Flush, who is the subject of a poem by was it Sylvia Plath? No, I don't have that right.
No, Virginia Woolf wrote
There we
a
go.
wrote a novel in the 20th century about Flush, but about Elizabeth Barrett's dog. What I presumably witnessing all these events from the dog's perspective, but I never read it, so I can't comment on it. In the play, The Barretts of Wimpole Street, the father's going to destroy the dog out of spite and anger when he realizes that when he learns that Elizabeth has eloped, but she foresaw that, and she took the dog with her.
Hmm. Which happens in real life. So they take Flush and they move to Italy, where they spend the rest of their lives together, or at least the rest of Elizabeth's life, which is 15 years. So she's not going to last another winter if she stays in England, and her father's okay with that, demands it. But yeah, he would have cut off another 15 years potentially of her life, and
Right.
so
If the doctors are right. Fortunately, Elizabeth had an income from her. Presumably, I don't know for sure, but I would guess she was a successful poet. She was making money from her writing, and she had an inheritance. I don't remember if it was from her mother or from some other member of her family. So she
I,
had.
yeah, it was from her
She,
aunt, I believe. But
okay,
yeah.
so from her aunt. So she had an income, which was also enabled her to elope, because Robert Browning wasn't making any money, yet at this time. But yeah, 15 years she lived in Italy, and what really strikes me, she had several miscarriages, but she gave birth in, was it 1849, I
Yes, I
believe.
believe so.
Yeah, to a healthy child. Their son who they called Penn. I think his name was Robert, but they called him Penn. John, she was 43 years old. Well, even today, it's often dangerous, for a woman to have a first child in her 40s, as far as I know. But this is 1849, when they knew very little about medicine. We did a hero. I love to refer to our past episodes. We did a hero show episode, and deservedly so, on Louis Pasteur. Well, and we discussed Joseph Lister, in that episode. This is pre-Lister, realizing that antiseptic conditions would improve the life expectancy, and of course Listerine later on named after Lister. And before Louis Pasteur identifying the theoretical reason why that so many of these illnesses are caused by microscopic organisms, that we call germs. Even so, and she was frail and sickly and everything. At age 43 in 1849, she gave birth to a healthy child. It's like a miracle, So you could see her increased vitality, 15 years of love, that they shared in Italy, and I think. John, I just happened to have here by coincidence. This is a copy of Sonnets from the Portuguese, and I think we should read a few of Elizabeth Barrett's love poems to her husband. I can't read them without crying, so people are gonna have to bear with me. But
just as introduction, so their work, they continued both to write and greatly affect each other's work, of course, and. I believe Sonnets from the Portuguese was published in 1850. Portuguese being, Robert Browning, his pet name for her was My Little Portuguese. And so this is her sly way of bringing that reference into her published work. And many of these were sonnets that she had written for him.
Yes, very touching. You're right. Elizabeth Barrett was dark. She had olive complexion, dark hair, looked like she was from Southern Europe. And so he called her my little Portuguese. And her tribute to him, when she wrote these love poems, she titled it Sonnets from the Portuguese. It's very touching. And he considered them the finest sonnets he said, in any language since Shakespeare. Now, granted, he may not be the most objective observer here, since he is deeply in love with the poetess. Nevertheless, there are some great love poems in Sonnets from the Portuguese, and one of them, not only the most famous poem that she ever wrote, but one of the most famous poems in all of literature is the one that begins, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways."
Yeah,
even people who don't know the first thing about literature have heard that. So let me start with that. That's Sonnet 43 in Sonnets from the Portuguese, which is a brilliant love poem. Well, it's not my favorite. I'm going to read my favorite afterwards. Not when I cry every time I read it, but how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall love thee but better after death.
Beautiful. What's your favorite?
The first one, actually.
First sonnet?
Yeah, Sonnet 1 from Sonnets from the Portuguese. This one always makes me cry. But that's okay. This is beautiful art we're dealing with. And it goes, if you can't experience the emotions of this, then you must be you must not care anything about romantic love. If somebody can't experience, especially knowing Elizabeth Barrett's story, when you know the story of her life and her relationship with Browning, what a tribute to her husband this is. I thought once how Theocritus had sung of the sweet years, the dear and wished for years, who each one in a gracious hand appears to bear a gift for mortals, old or young. And as I mused it in his antique tongue, I saw in gradual vision through my tears the sweet, sad years, the melancholy years, those of my own life who by turns had flung a shadow across me. Straightway I was aware, so weeping, how a mystic shape did move behind me and drew me backward by the hair. And a voice said in mastery while I strove, guess now who holds thee? Death, I said. But there the silver answer rang, not death, but love.
Beautiful.
Especially when you know her story. What a tribute to her husband that is.
I like to read one from Browning, and of course another love poem. And this one is called "Meeting at Night." And just listen for how well he's illustrating. You can really feel what's happening, and all these accusations, these criticisms that he was too abstract and too obscure. Well, no such thing with this poem. It's extremely concrete, and you can feel what's going on. The gray sea and the long black land, and the yellow half moon, large and low, and the startled little waves that leap in fiery ringlets from their sleep, as I gain the cove with pushing prow and quench its speed by the slushy sand, then a mile of warm sea-scented beach, 3 fields to cross till a farm appears, a tap at the pane, the quick sharp scratch, and blue spurt of a lighted match, and a voice less loud, though its joys and fear through its joys and fears, than the 2 hearts beating each to each.
Nice. I didn't even know that poem. What's the title, John?
That one's called Meeting at Night. And it describes the man out at sea and rowing through these fiery ringlets from their sleep, these waves that are coming up and coming into this cove, walking across the beach and walking several miles to get to his loved one at night. It's really beautiful imagery.
Yeah, that's Browning at his best. And Browning, perfected, like I said, he may have created, I'm not sure, but I know he perfected what became known as the dramatic monologue, where he has some character speaking, and the amount of information he can convey and the power of his writing is really at his best. It's really startling. And I want to thank Shoshana Milgram again for reminding me of My Last Duchess, which is a masterpiece. And listen to this. This is I think one of Browning's finest poems. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands work busily a day, and there she stands. Will please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrists too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one. My favor at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-year-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such a one and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss or there you exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessened so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive. Will please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Powerful stuff. By the way, before you even analyze this, notice a couple of turns of phrase. She had a heart too soon made glad. That's become part of the language. That you hear that phrase repeated sometimes. And Neptune taming a seahorse. That's the name of a novel by Robert Parker. One of the Spencer novels. Again, it's become part of the English language. This is Browning at his best. Notice the portrait, in relatively short poems, the two personalities he captures so well. The Duchess, very alive, gracious, smiling, with a heart too soon made glad, filled with the milk of human kindness, if I can quote Lady Macbeth. It's just this joyous soul. She had a joie de vivre. And here, her husband, cold, arrogant, more concerned about his 900-year-old name than the fact that he's married to a woman of such joie de vivre, of such a beautiful soul. And he says, what does he say? Commands were given, and she smiled no more. What does that mean? He had her murdered? That's the way it's usually interpreted. But you see Browning here able to capture in one dramatic monologue so much, one relatively short poem, so much about these two characters. The gracious, beautiful soul of the wife and the cold, arrogant, aristocratic, non-loving heart of her husband, and a sympathy for women. In Browning, he and his wife both, were well aware of the oppression of women in the world, and they were abolitionists. They believed in the rights of women to live their own lives, and you can see the sympathy that Browning has for the female character in this poem.
Yeah, definitely. Another, I think, really good example of a dramatic monologue, and one of his most popular, is How They Brought the Good News from Ghent to, I don't know how to pronounce this, Aix, A-I-X, a city in France. And
you're the expert in French here, John. Come on.
It's been a decade or two.
Okay. Well, you excel at so many other things. We'll forgive you.
That word I don't know, but This poem is really, really beautiful. It's not one of his love poems, but another example of how he can so quickly set the scene and tell a story with so few words and do so powerfully. And I won't read it, but I definitely encourage listeners to. And
you want to repeat the title?
It's called How They Brought the Good News from Ghent to what I'll call Aix, A-I-X, Ghent, G-H-E-N-T.
That's Belgium, right? Ghent, is
it?
I think it's in Belgium. I could be wrong, but here's something I do know, John, about this that is interesting. Browning's voice was recorded on an Edison device, I suppose, a early forerunner of the phonograph.
Cylinder, yeah,
and you can still hear it. I was listening to it this morning. It's hard to make out the words, but if you want to hear Browning's voice reciting this poem, you could find it online.
You can hear part of it. He also recorded as him apologizing for having forgotten some of the words, and he stops. But it is a pretty long poem, so can't blame him for that. And it's really beautiful, and I think illustrates their love of animals. I'm an animal lover, and recently, I actually didn't see this, but my wife told me about a a lab who his companion dog. I think it was a Chihuahua. So both were owned by this family, and the family wasn't home. Chihuahua fell into a pool, and the lab took him 35 minutes, but he finally saved this Chihuahua who couldn't get out of the pool. So this
Wow.
sort of heroic act by this dog that was all caught by their security cameras. And the hero of this poem, how they brought the good news from Ghent, I'll abbreviate it, is also an animal, and it's just a really, really beautiful story about this horse named Roland.
Well, I I just have to say, as an animal lover myself, and I love dogs, but I'm one of those people who love cats also.
Me too.
And there's that, there's, speaking of security footage, it was captured on video. I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. I think it was in California. Some kid on his tricycle in the driveway, and the neighbor's dog attacks him, and he drags the kid off the bike. You remember this? You could find it online. It's probably on YouTube. Anyhow, the family cat, a small female cat, comes out of nowhere. All you see is she's hurtling through the air. She slams into the side of this fairly good sized dog, and the dog doesn't know what hit him. Something came flying out and hit him, and he backs off, and he runs away, and she chases him. Him away. And
It's fantastic.
Yeah, Tara, her name is, and the kid's all bitten up after he's in the hospital or something, bandaged and everything, and he says Tara's a hero. So it's perfect for the hero show. But that is not generally, much as I love cats, that is not generally feline behavior. But you know what that is, John? That is definitely maternal behavior. She regarded this little boy as if he were her own kitten, and she protected him, as though that he was her kitten. So yeah, animals do heroic things, and as animal lovers, we can appreciate that and appreciate Browning's poem about this heroic cause.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess we should wind down. In 1861, after 15 years of a relatively robust life, she was still frail, and she still was on laudanum, and Browning tried to curb her drug habit, and everything. But they had 15 loving years and a healthy child. And by the way, from what I've read, Browning lived this active social life, and Elizabeth very often couldn't join him. She just didn't have that kind of physical vitality. But she was not like her father. She said, "Robert, you'll go and and meet with our friends tonight." And then at breakfast the next morning, he would tell her about what happened at the parties that he was at with their friends, and she took that all in. So she wasn't able to live a fully healthy life, but still, they had 15 years of love together, and remarkably, a healthy child. And when she died, nobody seems to know for sure what ailment she died from. But it was 1861, so she was 55. She had lived a lot longer than anybody thought she would, and not just lived, but she lived. She loved, and made love, and she wrote a beautiful love poetry, and she died on June 29th, by the way, my birthday, on June 29th, 1860. Wasn't that the date that Feynman married his invalid wife, Arlene Greenbaum? I think it was June 29th, 1941, maybe something like that.
You have an incredible memory. I just have to say that. I can't confirm that, but I wouldn't be surprised if you remembered that.
I think it was June 29th. It might have been, and it might have been 1941. I know it was at the start of World War One. But it's ironic because the love of finding his life, Arlene Greenbaum, was also an invalid and died, from tuberculosis at a very young age. He later on he did some spotty things as we discussed, but he was really in love with Arlene, and so that part of it's part of she died in her 20s. Elizabeth Barrett made it to 55, but she died in his arms.
Mm-hmm.
And he said she was smiling. Her last words was beautiful. It's beautiful, or something like that. What I do know is a couple of days later at her funeral, he was like oblivious to what was going on around him. They said he stood there, the tears just pouring down his cheeks. That I get choked up just thinking about Elizabeth's gone, and he couldn't live in Italy after that. I guess he saw his wife everywhere. The ghosts must have been ubiquitous. He took their son and went back to England, and for years he didn't do much writing. He was so broken up over the loss of his beloved.
And he soon, when he does make it back to the land of the living from his terrible sadness, joins some English literary circles and really starts to. This is where his career really starts to take off in his latter life.
Yeah,
writes some of his most popular works, the ones that earned him great fame, and there were even literary societies in his lifetime that were cropping up to study his works.
The Ring in the Book was I don't remember if it was written while Elizabeth was still alive or whether it was written after her death, but it definitely established his reputation, and it's later, it's later Browning, and John, he lived 28 years after Elizabeth's death, and like you said, he became a superstar, and he was this robust figure. There are some people who believe he had an affair with a woman. I don't remember her name.
Ashburton, I think.
Yeah, Lady Ashburton. That's right. But her, what her name was. But he didn't marry. He never remarried in 28 years.
One of Elizabeth's last works, and I think probably her most famous. I think it was her largest and most complex, Aurora Leigh. There's a quote from that I think the sentiment that she was trying to express is not the same that I take from it, but I want to read it because I think it ties in so nicely with our show here. It says in that book, all actual heroes are essential men, and all men possible heroes. And some interpret this, and I think probably correctly, that what she was saying here was, well, the heroes of yesteryear who did these great deeds, well, that's great and all, but everyone can be a hero to some extent, and this includes the people who never really do anything heroic, and that's where I have a bit of a bone to pick with her. I think that it's definitely the case that all men are possible heroes, but not all men take heroic actions and turn themselves into the heroes of their own story. But nonetheless, the idea that we're all possible heroes is certainly true, and we can learn a lot from the example of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett about heroism in romance.
Absolutely. I mean, in logic, if everybody's a hero, then nobody is. Mm-hmm. And Ayn Rand certainly thought that human beings have the heroic potential in them. I mean, to use Aristotle's terminology, but it's hardly the case that everybody actualizes that potential. But Elizabeth Barrett certainly did, rousing herself from her sickbed and her reclusive invalid home to marry the love of her life, to leave for Italy, to live for years after that in love and writing beautiful love poetry, bearing a healthy child, living a rich life, perhaps not as full as somebody of greater health like we were just discussing. She couldn't socialize as much as she might have liked, but still a rich, loving life with the love with her husband, the beautiful writing, the healthy child. It shows how much she shows how much is possible, even if you're physically ill, even if you're sickly, with that indomitable soul of hers, fueled by Robert Browning's robust vitality. I have enough energy for both of us, he says in the play. These two great poets. This is a heroic love story. I mentioned it's like Cyrano with a happy ending. Of all the true life, so many fictional love stories are heartbreaking. The Cyrano is a perfect example. It's not the only one. Tristan and Isolde, Hero and Leander. A lot of these fictional love stories are heartbreaking. But here's a Romeo and Juliet. Here's a real life love story that is absolutely heartwarming and inspiring. And I think we should salute both Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett for this is a heroic love story. So I want to say thank you, Robert and Elizabeth, for your love and joy and happiness in your life inspires us all. And I want to wish you, John, to feel better, and same to Rose, and have a heroic day and a heroic weekend, everybody out there in Hero Land. And we'll see you next week on the Hero Show.